Now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Patrick McGovern, who will be presenting his views about this world of ancient wines. And for your information, there are books present here at that table, which Patrick is willing to sign if you are willing to purchase them. And we would like to, I'll be one of your recipients of that signed book. But Patrick was, as I said earlier, the leading scientist in that project that worked on this 8,000 years old Georgian wine discovery. And but he's traveled the world. He's found many different places in starting from China and in the Middle East. There is a wonderful jar in this museum that he will mention, I'm sure, from Haji Firuz Zagros Mountains in Iran, which was oldest finding of wine before Georgian wines were discovered in south of Tbilisi. Patrick, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mamuka.
I think you have a presentation.
You're right. It's a pleasure to be here, and I welcome everybody to my home base, the Penn Museum, which, of course, it's already been described as having, really fantastic collections, one of which is the Haji Firuz jar that goes back to 5400 BC that you'll see as you enter the new Near Eastern exhibit. You can see it through a window, and it's very prominent. In a way, it's kind of the premier artifact of the museum. And of course, it's had to step aside for some Georgian evidence that I'll be talking about. And it's also this area of the museum is especially important to me because our laboratory, where we did many of the analyses of ancient wine, was right below this auditorium now. And this was just, renovated recently and what have you. So it's a pleasure to be here, but at the same time, I almost didn't make it. And you may notice my voice is a little rough and that I'm sort of shaky. It's because I developed a cold or some kind of flu, maybe, over the weekend that sort of put me down. And you'll be glad to know, though, that I've been tested by PCR, and I do not have COVID, so you don't have to worry about that. But you might want to still stay away from me just in case, I'm transmitting something. So it's, again, it's a great pleasure to speak to you about this subject. And so, many of the people here, of course, know about Qvevri wines, so I don't really have to go into this in much detail. But I always like this particular photograph of the winemaker who's so adept at sort of handling these ropes or sticks to be able to pull out a sample of the wine and check it. And of course, it's been vinified in a underground pottery vessel. So this represents a tradition. Before we had the modern stainless steel and even oak barrels, pottery was the primary material for making all kinds of vessels, but especially for wine vessels. And then, of course, if it's a white wine and you leave it, you don't filter it, you just have all the leaves and branches, etc. There, and you pour it into this pottery jar and let it sit for 3 or 4 months, you end up with a Qvevri wine or an amphora wine or an orange wine, amber. It's got all sorts of names. And I just think it's a fascinating process that is still ongoing in Georgia. But now if we think of how far back this process of using pottery vessels might go, Egypt provides us with a lot of really graphical pictorial evidence that is so evocative of what the process was. So it shows the pottery vessels that are made of that are there just to the right of the stomping platform, and and they were also sealed. And we have some of our, this goes back to 2500 BC, which is, quite amazing. And then you have a tomb fresco. At first, they put the actual vessels in the tomb. And then they got smart. They said, well, why don't we just represent these vessels and say, you have wine for thousands and thousands of years. And so they would give even the name of the pharaoh, the year of the production, possibly where the location of the vineyard was, on a stamped sealing made out of, they don't have cork at this point, but made out of clay. And that would seal the wine jar so that you would preserve it. Because it doesn't use the underground pottery jar, we think that most of this is done above ground as far as fermentation. So so you see the vat that's located right beneath the stomping platform. So this is where the wine probably went through an initial fermentation. Then it's transferred to the amphora or the Canaanite jar that's shown there. And it goes through a secondary fermentation in which you would actually put a hole through the clay stopper and let out any gases that might accumulate during the secondary fermentation. So this seems to be a different method from what develops in the northern part of Mesopotamia, using underground pottery jars. And of course, you see how advanced they were already at 2500, 3000 BC. The Egyptian wine industry starts at 3000 BC. And it is probably Canaanites that are primarily responsible for this, since they'd already had the wine industry for another 1,000 years before that. But you see that they understood how in the Nile Delta to keep the sun from being too intense by building up a pergola or some sort of a trellis system. And it also, is very convenient for the processing, picking the grapes and so forth. So I don't know how many people here have, seen my book, Ancient Wine, but as Mamuka said, there's some copies available. And what it tries to do, it's in a new edition now. It was first published in 2003. And it's sort of held up pretty well. I mean, we've had our scholarly debates about, various aspects, but it has the same text as a 2003 edition, but at the end of it, it has a fairly extensive afterword that, tries to bring it up to date. So, set a course for the future, where are things headed really? In making wine today, and how much of the ancient methods might be incorporated into modern winemaking. So since I'm a combination archaeologist, chemist, I'm not an archaeobotanist, I'm not a climatologist or whatever, but we had a lot of, it tries to bring together all the information that we have, which is, fairly minuscule, because archaeology only produces, a certain very small percentage of the original evidence. And then we, fortunately, in the last 20, 30 years, scientific methods have developed, so chemistry becomes important. And botany is very important because the grape is a plant. And there's other herbs and so forth that are added, and tree resins that I'll mention. So ancient texts, I already mentioned the artwork. We could talk about, lots of different artwork, but from later times, like the Romans, they show the process of winemaking. And also because wine is so embedded in these cultures, it carries on for thousands of years, just like Georgia. And so the ethnography, the ethnohistory of an area is very important to look at as well. And finally, we've tried to recreate some of these wines. And what has fascinated me just in the last month is I've been in contact with people in California that are actually making amphora wines in San Luis Obispo. And they are even setting up an amphora wine trail. So you can go through 15 different wineries that are making amphora wines or Qvevri wines. and taste them and, talk about them and so forth. So it really, I think, is developing on probably a worldwide basis. The other thing that happened is 2 weeks ago, I was involved in an ancient Roman wine conference in which we found out in much more detail that the ancient Romans made, they did their fermentation underground in jars as well. And they made Qvevri wine, essentially. And that was one of the most prominent productions that they did. What about that Haji Firuz jar that you can see out at the beginning of the exhibit? Well, we got involved with that because we had a lot of Neolithic excavations that this museum had done, one of which was Haji Firuz in the northern Zagros Mountains. So I just had to ask my local Neolithic specialist, Mary Voigt, if she had any interesting samples. She said, oh yes, she remembered from the site of Haji Firuz, they had some pottery jars that had a yellowish residue. But back when it was excavated in 1968, they didn't have the techniques to really figure out what the original contents of the vessel were. So they sort of, that samples, and the various samples associated with this from the Neolithic period, and the Neolithic is when we have all the earliest domestication and so forth, when it's quite possible that the grapevine was domesticated too, but that still remains to be seen. And we also had the invention of pottery. So around 6000 BC in the Near East, pottery appears. And the jar that you'll see outside here in the exhibit is the one on the left there. It's about 9-liter capacity, and there were 6 of them buried in the clay, or set down, not buried completely, set down into the clay floor of a kitchen of an ordinary house of a Neolithic village. And the idea is that because you have 6 jars like this, you have like 55 liters. Well, that's fairly, large production. And if you multiply that over the whole site, we're looking at, probably something that could only be accomplished if you had already domesticated the grape. But we still do not have, any actual domesticated grapes from the Neolithic period, even though I mentioned that in this book. At the time, we weren't sure about it, but then one of the grape pips was analyzed, and it turned out to be a modern grape pip. So you can imagine if you're excavating a site and some workman, is eating grapes and they just toss the grape pips over, it might get mixed in if you're not extremely careful with the excavated material. And then it also had clay stoppers at this early period, which is interesting to cut off oxygen. And so, we went to work on doing the analysis, and I won't go into all the details. Those are provided in the various articles on my website. And we're looking for a particular compound, tartaric acid, but now we've expanded that to include malic acids, succinic acid, citric acid, and so forth. So we can build up a real detailed picture. And we do use liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry, with a very sensitive detectors, but I can talk to some people about this later if you're interested. But we look for high amounts above the soil background of tartaric acid in particular, and that then is a signal that we have a grape product. And if they took special pains to keep it from going from wine to vinegar, then we make the assumption that it was probably the wine that they were after. And, as we see from the wine cultures that develop, that is not a bad inference. But, actually proving anything in archaeology is very difficult. So we talk about working hypotheses. So you have to be careful, when you say you've proved something, and, we still have a lot more work to do. But Georgia really stands out with some remarkable evidence like this sherd, that I see it as has a special clay design that might be related to grapes. And it's from the early Neolithic period. And we never analyzed this particular sherd, but it could show a grape arbor with grapes hanging down. It could show even a human figure, like a stick figure, kind of celebrating the vintage or whatever. And in fact, I mean, when I was the first time in Tbilisi, I was living in a house, an apartment right up on top of the ancient wall. And I looked out one evening after being in the museum and seeing this piece with my glass of wine in hand, of course. And I saw across on a modern electric building a very similar image to this figure going back, 8,000 years. So I think it's been a long road even for some of these artistic renditions. And you'll be hearing more about this site in Georgia that Steve BATIUK will be talking about. But we see the typical round Neolithic buildings of this site, and others like Shulaveri is very important. And what we mainly focus on are the bases of the jars where precipitates from the liquid can accumulate. And the one on the left is the reconstructed one, which we've never analyzed, but it does show a motif of what looks like a grape cluster, which is intriguing. And then the ones on the right are all positive examples of bases that we analyzed and were positive for tartaric acid and also the other organic acids in grape. And then we have our article that Mamuka also mentioned in the PNAS, which you can see just by scanning the people involved here. It's a really multidisciplinary project. And this is what I'd like to stress is that, any study of wine or any other food or beverage really requires a totally interdisciplinary approach. And you need to have people that are looking at the climate, the ancient climate, the botany, the chemistry, the archaeology has to be done very well. And you have to have very well dated, well provenienced, well preserved samples before you spend money on doing these analyses. I guess I'm sort of going forward here just by touching my, I don't know what happened there, but let's see. Okay, so if we did have a domesticated grape in the early Neolithic period, and that could include, various sites like Haji Firuz might have had it, but even up in Georgia. Why would you domesticate the grape? Well, the grape is domesticated because you want to have a hermaphroditic plant that has the male and female flowers or parts of the pistil and the stamens and so on the same flower, so they get pollinated very easily. The wild vine is dioecious. It has separate male and female plants. So you have to have insects or the wind take the pollen and put it over to the other plant. And let me go back here. So I've made an arrow there showing the hermaphroditic plant. And then you've also got to have horticultural methods to perpetuate, to clone the plant. And I think this is a big part of the issue that hasn't really been explained very well, is you have to know how to take a plant that you have a certain desirable property, such as sweetness, color, and so forth, and perpetuate that. Well, how do you do that? You have to figure out taking plants and either layering the vine underground so that it comes up again in another place and grows up another tree or the trellis or whatever, or take cuttings. And, this is something that it would take, I would think, take humans some time to figure out. The process of actually finding a hermaphroditic grape, and these are the Eurasian grape, and there are many species of grape, but the one we're looking at specifically is Vitis vinifera. It's difficult really to identify in the wild the hermaphroditic because the sexual organs are very small. You almost need a hand lens really to see them. And so we still don't really know where and when and how the hermaphroditic grape came into existence, but we're working on this, and we refer to the what's called the Noah hypothesis, because we think that the initial winemaking started in the Near East and then spread out from there. And so there must be a single time and place where the domestication occurred. And we know, from the biblical account that Noah was the first winemaker. He took, when he got off the ark on Mount Ararat, first thing he did was plant a vineyard and made wine and got drunk, and some terrible things sort of evolved out of that. And so they still grow grapes on Mount Ararat, and you can see some of the vineyards here in an Armenian monastery. It's very sensitive. So how do we go about looking at the DNA evidence for where that first domestication might have occurred? And we're focused on the mountainous regions where the wild grape grows very well. The wild grape distribution is shown here in red or purple. You can see that Haji Firuz is in it, the Georgian grapes are in it, and then this is sort of the world center of the grape. The greatest diversity is in that mountainous area. And so that's where the domestication would have had to occur. And so we focus on Iran, but of course, Iran's a very difficult place to work in these days. So there haven't been too many samples yet collected for DNA. And then the Caucasus, where we have a fairly good representation. And the Taurus Mountains, which is very important because it has some of the most fantastic Neolithic sites in the world, going back to 9500 BC. You'll see one article we published recently on this. Some people would, on my website as a PDF, but some people say that the einkorn wheat, or it's been fairly well substantiated, einkorn wheat was domesticated in that region, and the earliest beer comes from that area. But it could, of course, there could also be wine and honey mead and other beverages. And then we have Lebanon, which would be the first place that our ancestors would have seen the grape, because the grape did not grow in Egypt. The wild grape did not grow in Egypt. If you came out of Africa up the Levantine coast, the first place you'd see it is northern Israel and Lebanon. And I think they would be quite fascinated by this plant. But the reason we think too that the Near East and the mountainous areas are so important in the development and spread of the grapevine and winemaking is what's called the wine culture, where wine takes over the whole culture, essentially. I mean, we see this in the New World recently in California, New Zealand, and so forth. There's something about wine that really grabs people, and whether it's special ceremonies or religious involvement. I mean, of course, the reason for the religious involvement, I think, is the mind-altering effect, and so it's like you're communicating with the gods. And Georgia, I think, exemplifies this, and there are other regions as well. So, I mean, we have very good evidence now from Georgia, and it could be quite ancient, like the silver chalice that you see on the left, that shows a ruler probably with a cup taking a drink of something. We think it's probably wine. And then he has his retainers who are marching forward as well. And I guess they're antelopes. Whoops, I did it again. That might have been used in a special feast at the bottom. And I don't know how many people have been to Georgia here, probably quite a few, but you often see paintings by the artist Pirosmani in the restaurants and so forth, and he really indicates what the wine culture was in that period. And it probably wasn't that much different thousands of years earlier. And we've got the Toastmaster there, the Tamada, and we've got wine skins and pottery jars that show, how wine is really part of the culture. Now, when I went to the eastern Taurus Mountains to collect grapevines for DNA analysis, we got to the upper Euphrates River in the springtime, and there was tremendous amount of water flowing down the Euphrates. And I did find a hermaphroditic grape. And this is shown here. I mean, I've just found it. Unfortunately, I fell into the ravine, the deep chasm of the river right after that. I don't know if I just was so excited or what. And I had a terrible time getting out. Oops. And my colleague there from Ankara University, he had better shoes than I did, so he was able to pull me up to get started climbing out. And I then was able to make it back, and I'm here with you today, obviously. So we did a study of not just the Eastern Taurus grapes, but also other areas like Georgia and Armenia, Turkey, I guess. Yeah, Armenia too. And Europe, of course, and did a statistical analysis of the data for 20 microsatellites. And it turns out that the wild European grape of Vitis vinifera, as you see there on the left, is totally separated from the domesticated varieties in Europe. And yet it overlaps with Turkey and Georgia and so forth. And so that indicates that the origin of the grape is from the Near East, and then it's spread across. And, so far we've got tentative evidence there might be a separate domestication in Western Europe, let's say, Spain or Italy, but it hasn't really been proven yet. And then if you do a dendrogram to show how these grapes are related to one another, it turns out, especially the Georgian grapes in this study, came out very close to Pinot in particular. And Pinot is really the main grape that comes across in the transfer of viticulture. And it crosses with many other wild vines in Europe and produces a lot of the grapes that we know of today. And then we've got our very happy Qvevri person here. I just want to say a few words about this. These are very large vessels, but now the vessels that we have from Georgia from the Neolithic period, we don't know if they were buried underground. And it was, in fact, they have decorations on the outside, so why would you bury them? They have a small base that might argue for their being buried, but then it's a regular base that could have been used to support something, without being underground. So, up until the finding of this cave in Armenia called Irene, we really didn't have any evidence for the Qvevri underground before about 800 BC. And for Georgia, that still is the case. But yet, in Irene, we're back at 4000 BC. And we have the missing link that could go from the Neolithic down to the Chalcolithic and later. And inside that cave, there are stomping platforms that are plaster, and they run the juice right down into underground jars. So you really have the whole scenario of, you have grape pips, you have branches of grapes. So it's quite amazing. And my only hope is that Steve and his fellow archaeologists will someday find a cave like this and, maybe show that Georgia has it as early or even earlier. So we've got the sherds that we've been analyzing. I could go on at length, I won't, about how the wine culture spread out to Egypt and across the Mediterranean. And we end up with, this picture of grapes of all kinds, all sorts of varieties, with infinite variety of aromas and tastes and so forth, that are coming from the Near East and then crossing multiple times in secondary domestication centers to produce maybe 8,000 to 10,000 different cultivars. And that builds up a fantastic picture of the history of wine in which, every culture that has come in contact with this has developed its own form. And, whether it's Georgian, Canaanite, Egyptian. My hope is that, that we'll, see that, the grapevine and winemaking are so intertwined with human culture Going from the ancient Near East across to this is the Robert Mondavi winery in California, that we'll see that we have a real mosaic of all these wine cultures. And as far as the future is concerned, I mentioned the California initiative with the Amphora wine trail, making amphora wines in the Roman wine conference. I just had another California winemaker who sent me some bottles of his first attempt at making Retsina. I didn't really talk about Retsina, but that's very important in the whole tree resin preservation of wine, keeping it from going to vinegar. So I just hope when you taste these Georgian wines, which I suppose some of you have been doing the last few days, that you'll just sense in a way that you're recapitulating this fantastic history of wine and the grape. Thank you.
Maybe if there's one question, maybe one question over time, but that's okay. So if there is a question from the audience, maybe Patrick can also answer. Maybe. If I can hold it together. Okay. Go ahead.
Nitty-gritty question. In your DNA study, did you get to look at any Minoan stuff? And where does the Minoan lakes, are they near Eastern or are they
Yeah, well, we don't have any real good evidence on that, but the Minoan wine industry, starts around 2250, 2100, something like that, and it seems to be influenced by Egypt or the Canaanites in the shipping activities across to the islands of the Mediterranean. But to my knowledge, I don't know if anybody's collected grapevines or done any DNA study of that.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So very enlightening, definitely. And as always, we learned a lot from the presentation. Our next speaker is a very active archaeologist who travels the world. And like a month ago, he was in Mosul, Iraq, and returned like a couple of weeks ago from there. And somebody who worked in several sites in Georgia for the last decade or so, and who knows Georgian archaeological landscape very well, but he also has some new projects ongoing, and hopefully he will share where he stands on these new projects and developments in Georgia. Stephen BATIUK from University of Toronto is our next speaker. Please welcome him.
Bear with me, a small technology change here. And of course, the computer needs to finish booting. Well, I guess I'll just sort of start off by thanking Mamuka for organizing this conference again and inviting me again. It's greatly appreciated. I had a few challenges getting into the country, but I'm very happy to be here. And just to, well, a lot of this presentation is building on Pat's work, because as I jokingly say with a lot of my students, I always refer to Pat as the godfather of ancient alcohol, because he has worked on so many different things. Every time I start to work on something, I basically find he's already started it. Frustrating, but great at the same time. a lot of this that you'll hear today is building directly on his work. If I can get it to open now too. Are you getting the signal there, or do I have to? Oh, you are. Okay. Yeah. And slideshow. Oh, oops, this is the wrong one. Strange. There we go. Finally, here we go. All right. So it's been hard to believe that it's actually been almost 10 years since I published my article linking the Kuraxis culture of the early Bronze Age of the Caucasus and wine production, and for also perhaps connecting it to the spread of the use of wine in parts of the Near East. Who, again, once I sort of have to thank Pat, I'd been in discussions with him over the years about the ideas. Once it was published, I sent it to Pat, and he's the one that actually sent it on to the Georgians, who then brought me in on this larger project, which basically sent me down this wonderful rabbit hole of Georgian wine and ancient alcohol. Now, while the Georgian academic community wholeheartedly embraced the proposal for obvious reasons, the reaction from others, particularly our colleagues who work on the Kuraxis problem in Italy and Israel, were decidedly less receptive. They argued with me, and rightfully I would say, that my model was based wholly on circumstantial evidence. It was specifically vague spatial correlations. There was a lack of paleobotanical evidence of grapes at any of the sites. Physical evidence of the remains of wine production were missing, and there'd been no residue analysis that had really done. So they argued with me that it made the idea pretty much untenable. And part of it sort of stems from, I think, a misunderstanding of what I was trying to do with the article, which was to sort of shake up our discussions a bit about the Kuraxis and what their economic activities might have been, trying to move us past the more traditional pastoral nomad or trade in metals discussions. And I said to them, yeah, you're right. You know, the data isn't as strong as I would like it to be. But being sort of the cocky individual that I am, I said, you know, yes, the hard evidence is not there, but you know what? I think let's wait some years, and after some time, I'll be shown right. And slowly but surely, evidence is mounting, and that's what I'm going to try to sort of talk to you a bit about today. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the different, well, the nitty-gritty, if you will, of the archaeology of the Near East, probably don't know what the Kuraxis is. Now, the Kuraxis is an archaeological culture that first appeared in the mid-4th millennium in the South Caucasus, so in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. By about 3000 BC, it's found across, well, most of the Near East. It spreads from the Zagros Mountains to the south, being found at Godin Tepe, then across the Taurus down to the southern Levant. It's known by a variety of regional names: Karaz, red black burnish ware culture, Kirbek Kerak, Yannick ware. The Kuraxis represents one of the most widespread and long-lasting, yet probably one of the most least known archaeological cultures in our, well, in our field of study. Now, At present count, there's more than 1,500 settlements that actually bear this culture across Near East. Actually, I think my final count is 1545, which is an incredible number when you think about it. And that's all those dots on the map represent sites that have produced this culture. And evidence indicates that it's spread through a population migration and a variety of cross-cultural interactions. At its heart, though, are small, egalitarian agricultural villages organized, it seems, at sort of a tribal level. Now, grape seeds have been identified at sites in Georgia, Armenia, Dagestan, Iran, and Turkey, and even Israel now. As I said earlier, direct physical evidence of wine production, such as wine presses, have not been so far identified in the Kouroxy's context. But more recent palynological studies of various Kouroxy's finds have begun to identify growing evidence of wine and its importance to the cultures of the region, especially in possible cultic or ritualistic functions, I should say. Now, for the I told you so moment. Over the last 10 years or so, more and more paleobotanical data has started to emerge. Not a ton, but more is emerging. Evidence of domesticated grapes have been found at Kouroxy sites like Hisanat Gora and Khatskalebi in Georgia, Belikent in Dagestan, Shengavit in Armenia, and Kirin Shahir in Iran, as well as Arslan Tepe and Tainat in Turkey and Tel Bet Yara in Israel. But again, still in numbers that are frustratingly low, if you will, at least for my interests. However, given the low levels of systematic collections of paleobotanical remains at most excavations, this number might not be too surprising. There is, of course, an obvious dodge that the issue that basically we're looking in the wrong spots. This is not where the wine is made, so we're not going to find the seeds. And we could also go with another equally shaky suggestion that the seeds are perhaps being reused. They're being processed into perhaps an oil. Grapeseed oil. One of the conspicuous elements of the Kouroxy's agriculture is the complete lack of the production of pulses or oil-producing plants. Oil is, of course, a necessary element to any diet, so where are the Kouroxy's getting their oils from? Groundstone tools are common in a lot of the Kouroxy's contexts, but are hardly ever studied and could be used to process the seeds into oil. This really sort of calls out for a deeper look at this commonly overlooked part of the Kouroxy's archaeological record, but I'll just throw that idea out for discussion. But there also might be evidence that of viticulture that had been sort of there all along staring us in the face. The Kouroxy's are frequently linked to advanced metallurgy, but actually, rather ironically, we don't find a lot of metals in Kouroxy's sites. We find some simple weapons that you can see here, ornaments and tools. Of the tools, Tony Sagona in his 2018 book identifies simple bronze sickles that have been identified at a number of sites. The issue is their size. They're usually around 10 to 15 centimeters in size, never larger, and this is somewhat impractical for reaping wheat. However, they do form a good parallel to horticultural tools used for cutting or hafting branches that have been used, well, at least since the Roman period. So suggesting perhaps what you were asking about when we started to discover some of those skills, it might be already by the early Bronze Age. So not only have we learned a lot more about the evidence for wine in the Kouroxy's, but we're able to understand its use a little bit more if we look at alcohol in a wider scope. Now, it's long been recognized that the utility of food goes beyond simple subsistence. That is, it's something tied to a lot of symbolic constructs. Consumption of food can be linked to ethnicity, gender, social status, and it's also played a very important utilitarian role in the sacred since, well, the earliest times. Likewise, the multifaceted role of alcohol in both the ecstatic experience and mundane transactions of individuals predates our recorded history. The role of alcoholic beverages in general is a topic that, with the exception of PET, has only been appreciated in studies of the rise of Near Eastern complex societies over the, well, fairly recently. Scholars can now understand that it plays a similar role to that of food. As Pat has noticed, most studies in alcohol or studies in alcohol in ancient societies have focused on the role of health and nutrition, ritualistic functions, and or creating or reinforcing social identity. The role of alcohol in human history has changed significantly over time and space. However, in relation to the development of complex civilizations, alcoholic beverages regularly played an important role in the development of hierarchically structured societies in the Near East. Now, I thought actually Pat was going to go into more detail on the Neolithic of Georgia, so we'll sort of skip over some of it, but the earliest documented evidence of the intentional production of alcohol in the Near East comes from the Neolithic farming communities of the Caucasus that dates to the beginning of the 6th millennium. Now, the extreme high number of grape varieties in the region, as we heard, over 400, had long made it a primary candidate for being the cradle of wine, the region where the grapes were first domesticated and wine was first produced. And vessels from the Neolithic settlements of Shulaveris Gora, Gadashvili, and Khramisti Gora provide evidence of basically an unadulterated fermented grape wine stored in a simple clay vessel, which is probably sealed with a leather cover. And this is one of Pat's suggestions, which I had never thought of, with essentially the little bulbs around the top would have been used to tie the leather slip down. Now, evidence is mounting that early experimentation with making alcohol may extend back to the Paleolithic. This again is some of Pat's work. In many of his books, he discusses the evidence for the consumption of wine in these early periods, but evidence, especially for the production, has been frustratingly difficult to identify, mainly because of the nature of the data. Now, as the Epi-Paleolithic period, so we're talking 10,000 BC, is a period of experimentation with food production, it's logical for this to likewise be a period of experimenting with different forms of food processing, of which fermentation could be one aspect. The data from our Neolithic sites in Georgia, on the other hand, appears to show intentional production with a clear understanding of the process, and that the intent to produce a pure grape wine. Now, traditional approaches to the cultural study of ancient alcohols tend to avoid discussions of spirits and examines alcohol in a very sort of binary fashion, beer versus wine, ignoring for the most part things like meads and, well, spirits, although that's mainly due to the late development of distillation technology, as well as alcohol made from other fruits. Beer and wine production, however, might be more closely related than many credit it. Beer is well documented from at least the 4th millennium onward, but was for sure developed not too long after wine, if not the same time. Again, with sort of the first agricultural societies of the Near East. Now, the skin of the humble grape is one of the few vehicles, aside from figs and dates, for Saccharomyces, the main alcohol-producing yeast, well, to be found. The yeast is also used in bread and beer production. It's natural, occurring in grapes in the correct proportions alongside the proper amounts of sugars. The yeast can therefore quickly convert the sugars to alcohol at a level that will, as Pat so eloquently put it, eliminate competing microorganisms, so that that would spoil the beverage naturally. Now, this aforementioned binary approach to ancient study of alcohol obviously is misleading. Firstly, it ignores alcoholic beverages made from other sources, such as mead. Mead is made from the fermenting honey, and indeed, honey is one of the other natural environments where Saccharomyces is found in abundance. The combination of this natural occurring yeast with high levels of sugar in honey makes it likely that honey was probably an equally ancient source of alcohol. All that would be necessary would be water to dilute it. Honey was, in all probability, one of the early foodstuffs collected by Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. And some of the earliest evidence we have of humans using honey comes from the rock art at Cuevas de Araña in Valencia, Spain, which depicts an individual suspended by a rope collecting honey in a basket with bees buzzing around it, the image you see on the right here. Now, this rock art has been indirectly dated to around the 6th millennium BC, so about the same time as our work at Shulaveris. Wall paintings from the Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük depict what appears to be a honeycomb pattern, and residue analysis of vessels from the site provide evidence of beeswax dating to about the 7th millennium BC, which has been held up as evidence of honey collecting from which mead could obviously be made. Now, palynological data from our excavations at Șuleveriscora have shown that honey was used in a domestic setting or during in sort of a kitchen context that dates to about 5500 BC, implying that honey was being used, although the end product is unknown, probably some sort of cake or something like that. But creating an alcoholic beverage like mead out of it cannot really be ruled out. Indeed, Pat has shown us that the evidence for the earliest documented fermented beverage comes from Jiahu, China, and it's not honey mead, beer, or wine, but rather a mixed fermented beverage of all, made from rice beer, honey, honey mead, and fermented grape or hawthorn fruit juices. And therein lies the secondary problem to this binary approach to ancient alcohol. In these periods, straight wine or beer, in all likelihood, was a bit of a rarity. As beer mash lacks any of the natural sources of yeast, fermentation of the earliest beers probably were more easily more quickly jump-started with the inclusion of some yeast-laden berries. Now, the Greater Near East is a region of significant biodiversity, more so in the past than today. The Neolithic Revolution led to the domestication of many species of fruits that contained high enough levels of natural sugars to be fermented into alcohol. The highlands of the Caucasus, the Zagros and Taurus Mountains are home to many fruits that were exploited at a quite early time period in history, including apricots, peaches, sweet cherries, pomegranates, any of which that could be used to create an alcoholic beverage. The main missing ingredient, of course, was the source, more importantly, the understanding of the role of yeast. Once this was understood, alcoholic beverages could be made from a variety of fruits or processed starches based on their availability and society's developing tastes. Moreover, until the understanding of and technology of the proper storage and preservation of alcoholic beverages, most especially understanding how to stop the transformation of alcohol into vinegar, they would have been mixed and adulterated over the period of their storage to adjust for any changes in taste that might have occurred from the introduction of any sort of bad bacteria or oxygen. And evidence of this mixing can be found all over the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. Coming back to the Areni cave that Pat talked about. Organic residues from the storage containers of Areni, dating to about the 4th millennium BC, where we have this wine press, produce traces of grapes and also a red pigment that's derived from pomegranates, which may suggest perhaps a blending of these two regional fruits. Further afield, once again, Pat has identified Levantine wines found in the Dynasty Zerotumi UJ at Abydos, which contains sliced figs suspended on strings within the vessel. This was perhaps done in order to add extra flavor or sweetness, but figs are another source of yeast and perhaps added as a source for further fermentation, a secondary fermentation. Old Babylonian texts from Mari on the Euphrates make references to blending wines and beers into new cocktails, and wine stewards or cupbearers would mix spices and other tree resins to change and adjust beverages as they needed. Now, Pat's work has also shown that in the late Minoan 1A Crete period, a grog mixture of barley beer, honey mead, and resinated wine was produced and consumed. This Greek grog was consumed out of these mass-produced conical cups that are frequently found in late Minoan and in particularly late Minoan cultic contexts, in which this grog, or ancient kekion as it's called, was consumed. And again, this mixture bears remarkable parallels to the beverage identified by Pat in Tumulus MM, otherwise known as the Midas Mound at Gordion, deposited some 900 years later. Different spices were added to suit cultural preferences, but the combination of 3 alcoholic beverages, beer, mead, and wine, could also result in a more powerful cocktail or a higher alcoholic content than any of these 3 could do on their own. The combination would appear to have a long-lasting tradition in the Mediterranean world and Near Eastern world in ritualistic and funerary contexts. So the question is, how far back can we push it? And so this finally brings us back to our Kourouraxes folk, who might provide some clues about the early history of such cocktails or grogs. Now, identifying ritual with the Kourouraxes is a challenging task. Unlike other contemporary cultures, information pertaining to their cultic activity is difficult to discern. There's no writing. We're really sort of piecing things together based on the random things that we find in excavations. Possible public or communal halls have been found. What Mitchell Rothman would suggest are feasting halls. They've been found at Godin Tepe, Kvatskhalebi, possibly Arsan Tepe and Shengabit in Armenia. No temple structures have been identified at any Kuraxi settlements. Rather, ritual activity appears to have been centered on the household, with the hearth as the focus of all ritual activity. In houses within the homeland of the Kuraxi, so in Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and parts of eastern Turkey, the central hearth have a very sort of formulaic shape. It's trilobate with a rounded upper lobe and two lower heart-shaped lobes that are indented. These lobes serve in a way to support vessels over the heat source. However, the shape of the hearth bears a striking resemblance to a grapevine leaf. In numerous other examples, there is an indentation between the two lower lobes, where at least in one example from Shengabit, drinking cups were found. At the site of Pulor in eastern Anatolia, a different style of hearth was found with a human face and was surrounded by a large jar and numerous small cups. The hearth had actual channels carved into it to drain away the blood of the animals and animal sacrifices or the wine that was poured in libations. Later rebuildings at a building in Shengabit led to the addition of perforated platform that may have been used for libations as well. Antonio Sagona also noted numerous objects in connotation or in connections with domestic food products, such as sheep, cattle, arrowheads, all buried around these hearths at his site at Sosoyuk in eastern Turkey. So the focus of Kuraxi's ritual appears to be on the home and hearth, the center of agricultural society. Fire, or at least the hearth, was an important element, and based on the ceramic repertoire and their contexts, drinking and feasting are hypothesized to play an important role in these rituals. And the grape leaf shape may suggest that wine or wine-based beverages played a prominent role in the drinking aspects of these activities. Now, palynological analysis, the examination of pollen and other, well, non-pollen fragments, if you will, is a powerful tool in archaeological research. It's done more frequently in the reconstructing of environments, but it's beginning to be applied more and more to the analysis of vessels to help determine their contents, sort of a more economical proxy for residue analysis, which, as Pat noted, is more expensive to do. Where residue analysis looks for the organic chemical markers such as lipids or acids. Pollenography looks for microscopic materials such as pollen, insect remains, and inorganic fragments still preserved in the soil. It's not a replacement for residue analysis, but it's a good, powerful indicator for what food or drink may have been stored in or served in vessels. Now, Eliso Kovadze of the Georgian National Museum has been at the forefront of this analysis for the cultures of the Caucasus, and in particular, the reconstruction of the dietary habits of the ancient peoples of the region. Now, in analyzing a series of Kuraxi's vessels from the site of Aradetis Gora in Shidakartle, Kovadze has identified ritualistic uses of alcohol and other interesting patterns related to the mixing of alcohols, or at least I would suggest. So the site of Aradetis Gora, excavated by the Georgian-Italian Shidakartle Archaeological Project, led by Elena Rova. It's a large, important site in Georgia. In 2015, two zoomorphic vessels were found in a typical wattle and daub Kuraxi's house with a central hearth. The building was destroyed by a fire, and so it gives us a good solid date of about 2900 to 2880 for the date of the destruction. Now, the vessels, you can see them here on the right. They are oval in shape, thick-walled, heavily burnished with holes in the rear, as well as 3 small feet. There's an elongated neck preserved on both vessels, one of which preserves a triangular head, which has been identified as a stylized animal-human feature, if you will. The vessels are quite similar to each other, but are presently unique examples in the Kuraxi's repertoire. These are the only 2 we have so far. And the vessels appear to be raita, vessels for ritually consuming or pouring liquids, usually alcoholic beverages, a use that would fit well within the domestic shrines such as those at Pulor or Shengabit. which have those accommodating drains. Such vessels are well known from second millennium Anatolian or Cycladic context, but this is unique for the Kororaxes. Now, soil was taken from the vessels and analyzed according to standard methodology by Eliso, and the palynological spectra of the vessels identified 16 different tree, shrub, and 28 herb taxa, alongside a lot of Vitis vinifera or grape pollen. Here we go. The non-pollen polymorphs were basically fruit fly hairs, moth scales, fragments of bird feathers, freshwater algae. Now, Kravadze notes that the pollen spectra are remarkably similar to spectra of modern wine, as well as other vessels that have been found at the Kororaxi cemetery of Nachichavchebi, amphorae from the city of Vani, and the royal wine cellar at Treligorebi. Similarly, 3 vessels from the graves at a nearby cemetery called Dogluari produced evidence of grape pollen, which taken together is suggestive of wine being used in these Kororaxes contexts. The one divergence that Kravadze identifies for the Raita is that from Aradetes is that she identified evidence of old freshwater algae, which might indicate that the beverage had been mixed with water. All these examples point towards a prominent use of wine in ritual contexts. However, where the pollen and the non-pollen polymorphs plausibly suggest wine was in all of the vessels, on closer inspection, the spectra from the Raita suggest a little bit more of a complex picture. In comparison to other ancient and modern examples, the concentration of grape pollen in the Raita is lower than both the modern and ancient. They also preserve a higher concentrations of juglan, or juglan walnuts, as well as chicoride, so dandelion. The high concentration of walnut pollen is dismissed as likely the result of being species that grows close to the vineyards. However, the same concentrations are not found in any of the control soil samples. And also from the other ancient samples that have been examined. And while chicoride, the dandelion, is found in higher concentrations in sort of the control sections than vitis, it is higher. The concentrations are much higher in the Raita samples, suggesting its presence is not the result of sort of a background scatter inclusion. Additionally, the Raita spectra do not match the spectra of a large jar that's found in association with them, which one might presume was the source of the liquid that was being used in the Raita. Now, these differences in the spectra do not occur in any other contemporary or later examples, nor even modern ones. They're unique specifically to the Raita and, or specifically their context. Sorry. Now, the importance of these deviations might suggest that a different interpretation might be inferred. Perhaps the beverages, or perhaps beverages other than wine, more specifically a mix of beverages, were in use in the ritual associated with the Raita. An alcohol can be produced from fermenting dandelion petals and fruits, which is commonly known as dandelion wine, which is a long tradition across many different cultures. Grapes could serve as the base and the primary source of sugar, but more importantly, they could provide the yeast that was necessary to start the fermentation process. Similarly, although not as common, walnut wine can be made through the combination of unripened green walnuts and wine or grape juices. Now, these two beverages can be incredibly sweet, a sweetness that may have required mitigation by diluting it with water, which is evidenced in the non-pollen polymorphs. Additionally, when we look at the pollen counts, we have a lot of triticum and cereala, which suggests that we might be dealing with more of a malted beverage as well, made from wheat. Taken together, the spectra from the Raita from Aradetes Gora indicate less a pure wine and more of a cocktail of beer, dandelion wine, or walnut wine, or perhaps a combination of both. Perhaps with the addition of grape wine, not unlike our later Greek and Phrygian grogs identified by Pat. This reconstruction needs to be tested with residue analysis to more properly identify the unique ingredients that are found in the Raita. However, if the present interpretation is true, the context is also of interest. As with all archaeological investigations, context is key, and we have to pay tighter attention to the context of our discoveries. Now, the spectra from Couraxis vessels from Nachicevcheve and Dogloare come from funerary contexts, and they appear to represent the use of true or pure wine, suggesting that straight wine played a role in funerary rites. While the beverage consumed in the ritual context at Ardetis Gora appears to be a unique cocktail, a blend of 2 to 3 alcohols. The question, of course, is why? Assuming the linkage between the house and the focus of cultic activity in the Couraxis world, this beverage might represent an important part of the cultic rites. The resultant mixture would probably have had a higher alcohol content than straight wine, and therefore could be seen as a stronger psychoactive brew, adding to the ecstatic experience of any rituals that are being performed in these settings. This Caucasian cocktail, not unlike our later and better documented Minoan, Mycenaean, and Phrygian grogs, and the Greek kekion, appears to have been used as a focal point in ritualistic toasts or libations in ceremonies using specialized vessels like our raita. So once again, I'm making some rather large reconstructions based on a ridiculously small data set. But I'm once again just cocky enough to say that I think I might be onto something here. And given more time and more investigations, more evidence will emerge. But we need to adjust the way we look at the use of alcohol in ancient societies, and the Couraxis in particular. So in conclusion, alcohol has had a long and important place in the societies, well, in ancient societies beyond subsistence. As one of the most common, readily available, man-made, mind-altering substances, it has frequently played an important role in social constructs, and in particular, ritual. However, the more traditional binary approach to the historical research of alcohol, focusing mainly on beer and wine exclusively, overlooks other categories of alcohols and ones that have more specific uses. Grogs or cocktails, mixes of multiple forms of alcoholic beverages, which really, I think, Pat, you're the only one who really talks about these things, could have had, appear to have a longer and seemingly more important use in ritual. Their higher alcoholic content could have had a greater mind-altering capabilities, which when used for communing, which when used for communing with the divine, and would have therefore achieved its goals in a more expedient manner, if you will. The palynological data from the Couraxi sites suggests that alcohol, in particular wine, played a prominent role in the Couraxis ritual. However, the data from the Raita suggests that the Raita found at Ardetis Gora suggests a differentiation must be made between funerary and sort of cultic religious rituals, with more potent and mind-altering cocktails being reserved for the ecstatic experience. Thank you.
I'll just talk about it. My question was about the vessels. Okay, there we go. So you have, my main question is, what about reusing vessels for seasonal beverages, right? So the idea is that you have either this cocktail theory, and because you have the funeral jars, you know that specifically you could create one particular beverage for a particular use, right?
Yeah, they would have been one-time uses.
One-time uses, right. So the idea is, I wanted to ask you in terms of your research and obviously putting out your theory, how are you leaning any way with regards to thinking that you would have these materials showing up in the same vessel because maybe there was a seasonal production of things, as opposed to thinking the idea that it was a cocktail? I mean, could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
I'll be honest, I actually hadn't thought of that because I sort of ran with the assumption that people would have rinsed their vessels out at least on a fairly regular basis, because especially with like wine or anything sweet, you leave it in there, you will attract flies, and it would just get a little gross after a while, especially in anything that might be ritualistic. You know, cleansing is always an important role in ritual. So the idea that it was just left and we're dealing with the mix of residue, I suppose it's a possibility. Like I said, this is just a working theory, if you will, and I'll keep that in mind. But this is, again, one of the things that perhaps residue analysis might be able to give us more answers for.
Any other questions? Okay, so in the slide where you had, in the slide where you, where you had the arrangement of the vessels, like two different types of vessels, and they were arranged like, so were they that way found, or that's your extrapolation from the excavation?
You mean the Raita versus?
So if you go back in your presentation, probably 6 or 7 slides,
Okay.
if I counted right.
This?
Yes, this one.
They're the same. This is just the different views, the different angles of the same vessel.
Oh, it's a different angles.
Same,
Okay.
Yeah, it's like this is the front, bottom, rear, sides.
Okay.
Showing-
And the one back before this one. So no, the one yeah, this guy.
This.
So this I'm assuming that's like a TEM, EM picture. No, the one before this slide.
Sorry. This.
Yes.
These aren't vessels. This is the pollen.
Right. No, I'm assuming these are electron microscopy or transmission pictures. So like so what's exactly are you trying to see compared to current day, like pollen or the semen pictures? I don't know if I'm wording it right.
Well, so okay, these are just photos of grape pollen that have come from the context of the pots. So you have grape pollen, you have the insects, legs, and hairs. And that I think was cells from basically branches. I cheated. This is a photo from the PNAS article that we did. So this is technically the stuff from Chulaveres, but it's the same material that they're finding in the Raita. Are these basically the same thing? It's ancient pollen that's been found.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
A two-part question, actually. When you have this, when you find ancient seeds, are you able to tell what grape it was? Is that DNA research or something, or is that something that would be impossible, or something that might be possible in the future with better technology?
It's pretty close to impossible because most of the seeds that we found, I would say 99% of the seeds that we find are carbonized. That's basically the only way they'll be preserved. So when they're carbonized, we can't really get any DNA out of it. It's only very rare circumstances where they're preserved. Like at any one would be one where it's been actually preserved. It's not basically a carbonized fossil, and they could extract it from there. So like in ideal conditions, we would be able to, but it's just been so hard to be able to extract any DNA from seeds like this. There are few examples, but few and far between. What was the other part of the question?
I haven't asked it yet.
Okay.
If memory serves, Dr. McGovern had done a project with ancient beer, trying to recreate an ancient beer so that we could know how it tastes. Is there any way we could try to recreate one of these grogs that you're?
Oh, well, Pat's done it.
Tastes like.
Can you speak in mic?
You know, if you're, it depends on the natural products available in that area. And I think the Scandinavian evidence is like the best we ever got, because we could show that there was lingonberry, cranberry, bog cranberry, different herbs in very specific vessels, that came from good context and so on. Like even sieves were, where you had a plug of the material in the hull. So that article's on my website. But then if you're like in China, you're going to have other different natural products. Or if you're in the Americas, it's something different. I don't know if we've had any evidence for the Americas, but I find this, it's interesting. And I think, I mean, the botanical evidence is very important, in trying to, and the other question too about, you can have a reuse of a vessel, and you have to see like a basic consistency from, like for the Midas beverage, we had basically the same chemical results from many different vessels. So that suggested that, and it was in a special context where they probably wouldn't have used it beforehand. It was a unique occurrence. So then you can make an argument that it's a mixed beverage.
It's one of the important things that you look at most of the studies and everybody just talks about beer and wine. Pat is really the only one who's really has talked a lot about the mixed beverages. And I think it really has a much larger role than we have been giving it credit.
Well, I think so too.
We have a question from the web.
Yep.
Why wasn't wood used for the winemaking process in the ancient times? And why the modern winemaking took a turn towards oak barrels instead of continuing the tradition of pottery vessels?
Well, okay, I guess if you're talking about wood as a storage vessel, it probably was in some cases, but keep in mind it would have either been a solid hollowed out vessel to store it in, whereas barrels, there's more technology behind. You need the metal to be able to create the rings to hold it, to seal it. But again, wood is not preserved in the archaeological record for the most part, so we won't really know that for sure. Clay is just better because it's, well, easier to shape, different sizes. Well, Pat's probably the better person to answer a lot of these questions, but there's a lot of important characteristics of the clays that play a role in fermentation, even just sort of the aspects of wine. Like the shape of the Quevity vessel itself is important because of the way it actually increases sort of currents within the wine during fermentation. So it actually keeps the grapes flowing and having more skin contact with the wine on a regular basis until the fermentation system ends. But maybe Pat would probably want to answer that question.
Wait for a mic, please.
Like you said, so this is on, the preservation of oak, we really don't know when the shift, let's say the ancient Romans, they made their wine in underground queveries, or they're called dolia, but very similar. And, then it spreads out to the rest of the empire. Well, I mean, it was already there. It came from the east and it came into Italy, and then was sort of established, and then the Romans, expanded their empire up into Europe. And so in Europe, it seems as if these oak barrels were quite commonly used. So at some point, there must have been a shift over where they recognized that the aging in oak, had special properties. It added a tree resin, which you might like. It helped, and I mean, and Retsina, which is the Greek resonated wine with pine resin and so on, was well established in the ancient world. I didn't talk about it, but oak aging, is essentially the same thing. You're adding the components that are very different from the grape wine to begin with to the wine. And, the vanillin and all the other components that come with it. So either they like that, or they just, became more common, up in Europe, and then it gradually took over.
And if you want to pull up the slide again for a second, organic material is used for storage all the time. Here's our traditional Georgian wine trader who's carrying his wine in a wineskin. Wineskins were used for transportation and storage of wine. And we have references to it in the Sumerian period, so 4000 BC, where they're using it for storage of beer and water. So there was a lot of organic storage contents that were probably used for all these things. It's just that ceramic is, well, basically indestructible, and it's the bread and butter of archaeology. It's what we find all the time and what we look for all the time, really.
So Orgo started in 2011, and the key idea of Orgo Winery was preservation and promotion of older wines. It was a kind of link between our family's tradition and ancient winemaking. The first quality wine we bottled was vintage 2002. At present, so we have more than 200 small wineries producing quality wines.
So, done?
We cover quarry outside with mix of sand, concrete, and limestone.
What do you guys put on the inside of the quarry?
Beeswax.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very important for risk management.
Some of them are big, some of them are small. In general, cajetis, they're very big. Why are they so big?
It should be, how to say, optimal. Men should jump inside for washing.
This is like a great dream.
Yeah, here we can keep an age up to 15,000 bottles.
Wow, that much.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, here I keep vintage 2013. It's a year when my grandson was born.
Wow.
Katsiteli, 7 years old.
Oh, and you start
It's
to see
very
this.
well matured, so we can feel here the secondary aromas.
Right. So more
Sweet
raisin.
spices, dried fruits.
Yeah, you don't get as much of that, especially in the middle of the palate. Really soft. There's and the long finish, but the tannins are dry, but they're much softer here now.
Softer, yes. It should be dry.
It looks like the 7-year-old's even a little bit darker, so maybe it's a little bit vintage.
Yeah, I would say that
Close?
it's close.
Yeah, but maybe a little. You're getting kind of a smokiness to this. I don't know if you're getting that as well.
Like a silky character. So soft.
Very soft.
At the same time, so they're full with tannins, but with very soft tannins.
So how do you think older vines are affecting your wine's ageability? It's, obviously they're giving different quality. Does that play a part in how well your wines are aging?
Yes, older wines produce fairer grapes, but very concentrated, and they are rich with phenolics, with tannins, and it's a reason why wines made out of older wines are very potential for aging. Yeah. Kajetis is famous with grape growing. So here we have moderate continental climate with hot summers and quite cold winter.
What's the relationship with mountains and the river valley?
So right now, we are passing River Alazani. Alazani splits Alazani Valley in two parts. So now we are entering right bank of River Alazani. Left bank is closer to Caucasian Mountains, comparing with right bank. Right bank is richer with clay, sand, and minerals from ancient sea.
And we're kind of in the middle of the Caucasus, I see. So this is this place, what is this place called, this village?
Condoli.
Condoli, which is particularly, it's in the middle of Cajete.
Here we have less sun comparing the left bank. So we have winds and breeze from west to east.
And so in general, the vineyards where we're located here, this is the south and north, west,
Yes.
and east. And so you have this crosswind blowing that's going to protect from mildew and other things like this.
We are in a place which is surrounded with coconuts and this Silgombori Mount.
Beautiful. Who planted this vineyard and when?
It was planted around more than 50 years ago by my grandfather. This is Katsiteli. It's an old wine, 60 years old.
Tell me about pruning. In older vines, you have to prune a little differently or no?
Yeah, we prune as a GVino system. So it's low cropping wine. You see, we have just maybe 7 bunches.
Okay.
And so we get approximately 1.5 kilo per wine tree.
Wow, that's low for Cajete.
It's very low, but our focus is to get quality grapes, not quantity. Pilau amber, made in Quarry, natural yeast, skin contact, low sulfur, real Georgian wine.
In general, I think it's a perfect introduction to understand Cajete, a great way, especially for an American, somebody who doesn't know amber wine. It's a great way to learn about it.
Yes, it's the idea of this blend is that so I decided to connect strengths from Western style with strengths with Eastern style.
So to me, it seems like you found one of your missions in life, at least, making wine.
It was my dream. And from early childhood, I decided to be a winemaker. And it's a big pleasure for me to make wine together with family.
Did you imagine that this was where you were going to be happy and free to do all the things that you wanted to do? Or can you think back to that time?
Yes, sure. I was absolutely sure that this style, Quarry wine, had to have great future.
So now that you've achieved your dream, what is it that you really hope to continue to do for the rest, as long as you can?
To make new wines. So it's my intention to make more experiments, to explore new things. So this is my intention.
So your winemaking. How much?
Thank you. How gorgeous.
So in 2012, a real renaissance came back to Georgian wine, and I've been a part of that. It's been such an exciting thing to see that we've gone from almost no places where you could sit down, do a tasting, have this sort of modern wine culture to hundreds, if not thousands now, of small family wineries, of large wineries. You have medium-sized wineries. You have all of the different sizes now in Georgia, a lot of different futures, a lot of different families coming to realize what it means to be free, especially after a period of almost 100 years of ruling by the Soviet Union. People are finding their freedom in winemaking and finding that they can say their own voice. They're able to mix this tradition of 8,000 years of winemaking and what they remember before the Soviet times with their modern aspirations. And to me, it's a real picture of what a full life can be. And it's so interesting that Georgia has a culture where that can never be separated from winemaking. Guria, for me, is a particular love. It's a tiny place with a people who are fast and funny and bright, and their wines reflect that directly with Xaveri and Sakamiela and Johnny and Srilatavani. Lots of different humors, lots of different tapes, but in general, fast, high-toned, crisp, really interesting wines.
ამ ეზოში პირველი ვაზი ჩემმა დიდმა ბაბუამ დარგო, დღესაც ცოცხალია ის ვაზი და იმ ვაზმა მომცა რაღაც სტიმული. დაბრუნება ქვია ჩემ შემთხვევაში, იმიტომ რომ 10 წელი ვიცხოვრე თბილისში, მაგრამ დაბრუნდი, იმიტომ რომ ეს მეურნეობაც კი რაც გვაქვს, მე უკვე მამა ჩემიდან მივიღე და ხედავდი რომ აღარ იყო ისეთი ხარისხის და დავიწყე ფიქრი რომ რითი შეიძლებოდა უფრო უკეთესი გამეხადა ეს ყველაფერი. შემდეგ გამოჩნდა კარგი ადამიანები და მათი რჩევით, დახმარებით დავიწყეთ ჩვენც უკვე ფიქრი რომ გვეწარმოებინა ღვინო. დღეს მადლობელი ვარ რომ აქ ვარ, ამ ადგილზე ვარ, ჩემი წინაპრების ადგილზე ვარ და ვაგრძელებ იმ საქმეს, რაც დაიწყეს ჩემმა წინაპრებმა.
რაფი ახარ? ოხარ მაგრად.
რავი, არა ვიშავს, რა. ღვთისმსალობით.
კი, როგორ არის ეკეთი?
აბა,
ოჯახი როგორ აკარ?
კარგად. როგორ ახარ?
რა ვიცი, მიხარი რომ აკოვა რა. ეს ხო, ეს ალადასტურია.
ხო, ეს ძველთა ძველი ალადასტურია. დაახლოებით 150 წლის არის, როცა ჩვენი სახლი ჩემმა დიდმა ბაბუამ ააშენა და ესეც ცესორიძირი მაშინ. კარგეს?
და ამხელა რატომ იყო რა? ეს არის რაც მაქსიმუმს ხეზე იყო, როგორ?
ხეზე იყო, ეს დიდ ბლის ხეზე რა, მაღლა.
ეს იყო გურული ტრადიცია, ხეზე.
გურული ტრადიცია კი, ყველა ვაზი, არა მარტო ჩხავერი, ალადასტურიც, კამური თუ ნებისმიერი ჯიში იყო ხეებზე, მაღლა და არ ხდებოდა შეწამლა და სვავდნენ ნატურალურ ღვინოს და ცოცხლობდნენ დიდხანს. ესეც ჩვენი საკოლექციო ნაკვეთნოა, ალადასტური, სხილათუბანი, სხვადასხვა ჯიშები არის, რომელიც მოვიძიეთ 2015-ში, გავაშენეთ. და უკვე მესამე წელია უკვე მოსავალ ცველობდები ჩხავერი, ჩვენი გურულების სიამაყე, ჯიში და მტევანდიდი, რომელიც არაჩვეულებრივი ღვინო დგება, წითელი, ისეთი აი ბროწეულისფერი რა, მუქი და
შენ ყველაზე მეტად გაქვს მოსავალი ჩხავერი.
კი, ჩხავერის გვაქვს ახლობით მოსავალი 70% ჩხავერი არის, დანარჩენი სხვადასხვა ჯიშები, გურული ენდემური ჯიშები.
ჩხავერი საერთოდ საინტერესო ჯიშია.
საინტერესო ჯიში არის, ნამდვილად, საკმაოდ მაღალი ხარისხის ღვინო დგება და ორი სახის ღვინოს ვაწარმოებთ. ჯიში როგორც ასეთი არის ვარდისფერი, მაგრამ შეგვიძლია ჭაჭასთან კონტაქტის გარეშე ღვინო მივიღოთ ქარვისფერი, რომელიც ძალიან კარგი თვისებებით გამოირჩევა. ქარვისფერი ცოლიკაური,
კი ბატონო,
დავარგებული 100% ჭაჭაზე, თავის ჭაჭით წვენით გავაცალეთ კლერტი და ფერმენტაციის შემდეგაც ერთი თვე დავაყოვნეთ ქვევში, გურულ ჭურში, ასე ვთქვათ. გურული ქვევრი არის აცანაში მზადდება, გურიაში, ლანჩხუთის რაიონში. აქ სადაც ჩვენ ახლა ვდგავართ, ძველი ღია მარანი იყო, ჩემ დიდი ბაბუის აშენებული და იქ ძველი ქვევრები რო ამოვიღეთ უკვე, დაახლოებით 250-300 წლის ქვევრები იყო. ყველას ესეთი ის ქონდა, რა ქვია, ტრადიციულად განსხვავებული ფორმა და ამახასიათებელი გურული ქვევრების და გურული მექვევრეების ხელნაკეთი. გურიაში უფრო აი უხეში და მყიფე თიხა არის, შესაბამისად სქელკედლიანი ქვევრი მემზადდება და იმიტომ აქვს აი ეს გურულფებს სპეციალურად აი თავისი დამახასიათებელი კალები, ზოლები, რომ აი მოჭიდება ქონდეს მიწაში ჩადების დროს და აი სიმაგრეს უნარჩუნებს.
Kvevri raton mitsas kvesh არის.
ტემპერატურა. ზამთარი, ზაფხული, ტემპერატურული რეჟიმი ბუნებრივად ერთი და იგივე დონეზე არის და დუღილის პროცესის ფერმენტაციას და დავარგება შენახვაც მიდის ერთი და იგივე ტემპერატურაზე. ზოგადად გურიაში ჯიშების 80% არის გვიანი რთველის, ტემპერატურაც ზოგადად დაბალი არის და ქვევში აგრძელებს დუღილს ჩვეულებრივად ცოტა ხანგრძლივათაც, მაგრამ სტაბილურად. ნელი, ნაზი პროცესები მიმდინარეობს და შესაბამისად ღვინოც კი ესეთი დგება საბოლოოდ.
Ამდენად. Oh, ეს საწყარია. აი შეხედე ფერი, ესეთი ძალიან ლამაზი ლალის ფერი და ესეთი როგორც ჩვენები როგორც ნორმა არის ალადასტურში და შევაფასოთ ესეთი არომატი ამოდის რა ბრუნებრივად აი ეს ჩიქე როგორც აი აქამდე შეგვიძლია უსწონა და ესეთი სუფთა ალადასტურის გემოვაც ეს ბლის და ციტელი კურკიანი ხილი ძალიან საინტერესო და მსოფლიოსთვის საინტერესო ჩემი აზრით.
რომ არა ტრადიციის პატივისცემა, რომ არა ჩემი წინაპრების, რომ არა ჩემი მშობლების, მე შეიძლება დღეს აქ არ ვყოფილიყავ. ტრადიცია არის ჩემთვის, მე მახსოვს მამაჩემი როგორ წურავდა, როგორ ეფერებოდა მას. გაფუჩქნა იქნებოდა, მოვლა იქნებოდა, ყოველთვის საუკეთესო ღვინო ქონდა, არ დავბადებულ ვარ ვენახში, თორე გავიზარდე ვენახში.
აბა
აი ქვაქვიშნარი ვაზისთვის საუკეთესო
დიდი ქვები და პატრები.
კი, მინერალები,
ესაც კაია.
ბუნებრივი დრენაჟი არის, რომელიც აუცილებელი არის, რომ ხარისხიანი მოსავალი მივიღოთ. და კლიმატი შესაბამისად ზღვის დონიდან ვიყოფებით 180-200 მეტრზე დაახლოებით. შავი ზღვის კლიმატი იგრძნობა, მაღალი ნესტი არის. მაგრამ საბედნიეროდ ვართ მდინარე სუფსის განაპირას, ნიავიც იგრძნობა, ხო? აი სულ დილი ჩუადღე საღამოც სულ ნიავი არის, და აუცილებელიც არის, რომ ეს ვაზის სოკოვანი დაავადებები რომ მინიმუმამდე იყოს აყვანილი, ეს ბუნებრივად. რა თქმა უნდა.
შეხედე.
კი, ეს ჩოხატაურის მუნიციპალიტეტი არის, სოფლები ბუკიციხე არის, დამლაციხე არის, საყვავის ტყე და სადაც ვიმყოფებით ეს არის სოფელი ერკეთი.
In a place where mankind first began its love affair with the grapevine over 8,000 years ago, the tiny country of Georgia, nestled in the Caucasus Mountains, is still making wine. Searching for the origins of winemaking, we capture a man whose passion for wine brought him thousands of miles to Georgia. Join him as he leads you through 5 regions, meets 5 pioneering winemakers, using ancient winemaking vessels and local grapes, and bringing them back to life. Discover how this beautiful country, which after decades of Soviet rule and industrial farming, is paving a new future by returning to what Georgians have always done, making wine. This is Georgia Rewind.